Hey guys, and welcome back to another lesson. I've been wanting to do a lesson for a while, covering a bunch of different tips and tricks very quickly in a shallow manner, but in a way that will hopefully inspire you to improve your playing. And this is meant to help musicians kind of starting out, either beginner or intermediate stages, to improve their playing, going from just playing simple chords to something that is a bit more complicated, So let's get started. The first thing is you should try and graduate from playing simple triads, some of the time at least, to adding higher extensions, playing 7th, 9th, and 11th chords and 13th chords. So for example, instead of playing an A minor like this, you might play an A minor 7, or A minor 9, or A minor 11. Similarly, for an F major, you might play an F major 7 or F major 9. If you're in the key of C, then sometimes it doesn't work out, because if you look at this G major 9, there's an avoid note here, this thing that is not in the actual scale. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but you should at least try and see whether the additional degrees fit into your scale and see how they sound. Tip number 2, if you're already talking about chords with higher degrees, then it's a good idea to learn some famous chord voicings. Some voicings are so famous they are named after a musician or a piece. For example, there's this voicing for an A minor 11, or just any minor 11 chord really. This is called the, colloquially speaking, the Herbie Hancock voicing. So whenever you see a minor 11 chord, let's say an A minor 11, you can play something like this. If it's a D minor 11, you can play something like this. So something to sort of get under your belt. Bill Evans used to play 13th chords, dominant 13th chords, like this. This would be a rootless C13th chord. You can add the root. Or you can just play this kind of the shell voicing in your left or right hand, F13th, G13th, and so on and so on. Just one last example. This is called the So What chord, again made popular by Bill Evans. This is a C minor 11. And it has some fourths in it, so it gives it kind of a modern, ambiguous sound. So these are 3 to get you started, but it's, just go ahead and hunt down a few more, and every time you see a named chord, try to sort of add it to your repertoire. The next tip, tip number 3, is add motion to your playing by arpeggiating what it is you're playing. So, if you have an A minor chord, then instead of just hitting it like this, you can hit it and arpeggiate it. Now, you can arpeggiate it across both hands. You don't just hit maybe the bass, keep it static, and do the right hand. You could, of course, but sometimes it's interesting to also add into the pattern the left hand as well, make it part of the entire arpeggiation pattern. Tip number 4 is don't play, or play whatever it is you're playing, at the right register on the piano. This means that, if you look at this A minor chord, if I play it up here, it sounds kind of small and tiny. And if I play it down here, it sounds muddy. You'd probably not play this, and you might play this if you're doing something, very delicate. So play at the appropriate register in the piano. The middle kind of range is where you get the most body and clarity. Related to this and to the previous tip, then tip number 5 is that arpeggiation can sometimes clear the muddiness. You know, if you have, let's say, a chord, let's put a C, this C minor chord, right? It sounds pretty muddy here. But if I arpeggiate the notes and maybe not hold down the pedal, or maybe hold it down only when I'm doing these upper notes, something like this, then it becomes less muddy and maybe more useful, right? Let's say I'm trying to write a scary melody. Well, something to think about for reducing our arpeggiation. Next tip, tip number 6, has to do with planing chords. And planing just basically means moving the chord, and this would be called chromatic planing, moving the chord as is across the keyboard. And this has this kind of, let's say, maybe jazzy sound. Let's say you have this voicing for just actually, I'll switch to an electric piano, an A minor 11. Really as simple as it gets in terms of I'm just playing the root form here. And then I can play an F minor 11 to a D minor 11. So, you know, just by moving around, I get this kind of, I guess, kind of an R&B feel to it, I guess. You can do something, of course, that is more complicated than the root form. So, you know, maybe let's do this kind of voicing. It's a little bit more clustery when moving some of the notes around. Sometimes just taking a chord and moving it around, almost, I'd say, maybe even randomly, can produce some interesting and pleasing chord progressions. Okay, let's go back to the piano. And the next thing I want to talk about is, again, related to voicings. And it has to do with the fact that it's kind of good for every chord that you know to have a couple of different variations. And let's take an A minor, and let's take an A minor 11. So I can play this A minor 11 and open it up like this, or I can close it up, play it kind of like a clustered voicing, or there's kind of the middle option, which is this Herbie Hancock voicing I've shown you. So you got a couple of different variations, some of which are open and some of which are closed, kind of clustered. So something to think about. Are you playing something that is open or closed? And of course this will affect the muddiness, right? If you play something clustered down here, it's very muddy. If you open it up, it becomes less muddy. Next tip, tip number 8, it has to do with avoid notes. And I'd say that the tip is that avoid notes are sometimes more important than scales. And let me explain what I mean by this. Let's say you're playing something in C major, right? So a lot of times what you'll find out is when you're, let's say, you're soloing or playing or even thinking about voicing a C major 7 or C major 9 chord, then it turns out that the 4th degree is really kind of a very displeasing sound. So you can play, when you solo, any of the notes of the C major scale, but the 4th kind of always tends to cause problems. And this is sometimes why it's called an avoid note. Now, it doesn't mean that you cannot play it. It can, lead you somewhere. But if you usually don't want to dwell on it. So it's often a good idea when you're playing, soloing over a chord, to ask yourself not what's the right scale for me to use, but rather what are the notes I should avoid. Something to think about. And related kind of concept is the minor pentatonic scale, which is my next tip, which is that you should familiarize yourself with this kind of scale. It's kind of funny, actually. Guitar players grow up and start soloing on minor pentatonic and pentatonic scales in general. But piano players never seem to really get into them until a later part of their development. And I find this to be kind of, I'd say maybe, I don't know if inefficient is the right word, but let's say you have an A minor chord. So the A minor pentatonic is A, C, D, E, and G. And what's good about these minor pentatonic scales is that they tend to avoid notes that clash with a large number of chords. It's probably not why they were invented, but it's just one of their benefits. So, if you have a progression, let's say from an A minor to an F, to a D minor, so you see I'm playing the same A minor pentatonic over all of these different chords, just playing very simple chords in the left hand. And it doesn't clash with any of them. And this, by the way, is why a lot of songs, if you listen to the melody of modern pop songs, a lot of them are sung over a pentatonic scale. So try to pay attention to songs that you listen to on Spotify or the radio or whatever it is. I don't think a lot of people listen to the radio anymore. I guess it just shows my age at this point. Okay, next tip number 10, it's learn to play out of scale. And let's say that you're playing in you have a progression in A minor. So A minor to an F major to a G major. Now, you might play a D minor, an E minor, an F, a C. So all of these chords are within scale, right? You have some sort of scale that you're playing in, this A minor, but sometimes it pays off to sort of get out of the scale and get back into it. So something that you might end up doing is, let's say, see, I've played this B minor here and then resolved it to an F major. It gives it kind of an interesting sound. Maybe I could do something like, let's say, an A minor to F sharp minor, D sharp minor, D minor, E minor. So when you take the listener out of the scale, you're sort of doing something they don't really expect. And that's sometimes a very good thing, just subvert the expectations of the listener. Not too much, of course. Next tip number 11, is to give your playing some breathing room. And this is important when you're looking at arrangements or when you're playing with others. A lot of people think that, if you hear something that is very very big, it has a lot of motion, it's a good thing. But not necessarily, it depends on what's happening around you. If you're playing, let's say, with a bass player, then sometimes you might want to omit the bass of the chord that they're already playing. So they might be playing a C, and you might be playing you're playing a C major 9, so you might be only playing the upper structure of this, right? So you could omit the root or omit some notes. Another thing, maybe you just want to play some stabs. Maybe that's what the song calls for. Maybe you don't even want to play during the verse at all. Maybe you just want to play during the chorus. Maybe all you need to do is play a simple arpeggiation. You don't always have to play something that is big and fills up all of the space. So always give this some thought. Next tip number 12, is when voicing chords, you should incorporate and identify 7-1-5 voicings and 1-2-5-7 voicings. So what do I mean by this? Here's my C major scale. You number the notes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And a 7-1-5 voicing is just the 7, 1, and 5 degrees of the scale you're in. And this kind of combination sounds very beautiful. So it works for C, for F, and then in some other cases it takes you out of scale, but it's still worth learning. So if you have a C major, you might play this in the right hand. It's not even a C major because I'm not playing the third, so it's kind of ambiguous, but it's very open and spacey. I could add the third here, get this nice open voicing. Here I'm doing a voicing in the left hand of an F major, but I'm doing this 7-1-5 in the key of F. So I'm basically an F major chord. So you get these very nice voicings by working with this kind of motif. The 1-2-5-7 is another such voicing. This is, I guess you could call this a C major 7 sus2. Again, a very nice, beautiful open voicing. And you can move it around. It has a minor, of course, variation. Another example, look at this. So what you see here is it's kind of like the mirror image of the 7-1-5. It's not an inversion, but you get this fifth here and then a small cluster. So it's kind of like looking at this, you get a fifth and a small cluster. So this also works well in reverse. And I can combine them. Maybe do something like this. Gives you ideas for beautiful voicings. Next tip number 13, is always think about voice leading, right? When you play chords, you don't want to jump around. If you have a C major to an F major to a G major, you always want to use the inversions. Well, not always, but it's probably most of the time you want to use the inversions that minimize the motion of the notes between the chords. So not jump around, but rather, or maybe, and again, if you have something that is a bit more modern, so you can do an A minor 11 to an F major, right? So you see how little motion there is between the two chords I'm playing. I'm barely moving around. So I would say my voice leading here is pretty tight. Another tip number 14, is add the second. So if you're playing any chord, let's say a C major, you're playing on the first, third, and fifth degrees of the C major scale, and almost always adding the second degree results in kind of a more modern full sound. F major add 2, C major add 2, this would be an A minor add 2, it's kind of nice to add this motion to, nice for ballads. Don't overdo it, of course, with just like any other tip. Don't do it all the time. Sometimes, but it's a little less common than adding the 2, you can also add the 4th. Now, it has a little bit more dissonance, and sometimes it will lead to notes that are out of scale, which might or might not be a good thing. So C, add 4, G add 4, F add 4, C add 4. And of course, you should do voice leading, so C add 4, G add 4. Okay, tip number 16. That's just a small cheat that I use quite a lot, and I think I've seen other players do as well. Use your thumb when you're doing like a big voicing or even a small one to hit more than one note. Works best when you're hitting 2 white notes. Doesn't work as nicely with the black ones, and it doesn't work at all between a black and a white one. But for example, if I'm hitting something like playing a, let's say, a C major over the bass of E, I can use my thumb to hit these 2 notes together, and this would be the add 2. So this would be a C major add 2 over the bass of F, and it just fills up the sound. You know, another example, something a little bigger that you've already seen me do in this lesson. I'm cheating here twice, hitting these 2 notes and these 2 notes when playing this A minor 11 voicing. And here in the middle, I create this nice cluster that gives me a modern sound. All right, next tip, tip number 17, which is don't be afraid or familiarize yourself with 6/9 chords. A lot of people get caught up when learning higher extensions, and in 7th chord, you know, so you get an F, you play F major 7, F major 9, but people tend to, well, at least some people tend to disregard the F6/9 chord, for example, and it has a different sound, and it's, you know, beautiful in its own right, just like say a C6/9. And these sort of voicings give up on the 7th, they don't include it on purpose. So I might play an A minor 9 to be precise, and then this F6/9. So these chords really are quite beautiful and worth getting to, you know, just getting around them. We don't have a lot of more time. Probably some of the tips will be left for next time, but let's do a few quick other ones. Tip number 18, don't always play the root of the chord. When you see a C major chord, you don't always have to play the root. Sometimes just the upper notes would be good enough, especially if the bass player is already playing the root. So this lets you make your chords a little bit lighter. They take up less space, like in the frequency spectrum, which often is a good thing because you have other instruments and other things in the arrangement going on, and sometimes you don't want to be too overbearing. Like I said, don't use space when you can. Another example, a lot of chords are specifically voiced in a rootless manner. And I've given you one example of this. This would be a C13th chord, and it doesn't have the C in it. It's a rootless voicing. So this would be an F13. In fact, if you look at chords, let's say this C major 9 chord, the two most useless degrees are the root and the fifth, which is why a lot of chord voicings will end up omitting them. And this brings me to tip number 19, which is if you omit the root, also omit the fifth. Well, at least sometimes. Play around with this. Again, if we go back to this voicing of the C13th chord, it also doesn't play the fifth, which would be a G, right? This would be the full C13th voicing. Here's the root, here's the fifth. We're only playing this, and this. Okay, I think we're out of time for this lesson. If there's a good response to what I just played, I'll do a second part, and I have a bunch of other tips that I didn't get around to about voicing, layering, playing, using pedal notes, emulating other instruments, doing blues, and many other things, substitutions. So if it's well received, we'll definitely do another version. Just let me know in the comments, and I'll read them, and we'll see what happens. That's it. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I will see you next time.